Yeah, absolutely. I literally had the X-ray results in about 2 days ago.
Really?
Yeah, because I've still got this rod in my back, and I've got like
What?
screws.
There is a version of Simon Cowell that the world thinks it knows, and for a long time that version was enough. The man behind the table, arms crossed, face unreadable. A voice that could dismantle a lifelong dream in 4 seconds flat. For decades, that image lived everywhere, on television screens in quiet living rooms across America and Britain, in newspaper headlines, in casual conversation. Woven into the fabric of popular culture itself. He became one of the most recognized figures in the entertainment industry, not because people loved him, but because he was real in a way that almost no one else in his world was willing to be. He didn't pretend, he didn't soften the blow. He looked you in the eye and told you the truth, even when the truth was the last thing you wanted to hear. And somehow, in a world full of performance and polish and carefully managed impressions, that made him iconic. But there is something quietly inevitable that happens when a person spends their entire life being the one who judges, the one who decides, who controls, who shapes the outcomes of other people's stories. Eventually, life stops asking for permission. Eventually, something arrives that no amount of power, money, or influence can simply cut off at the audition stage. Something that doesn't care who you are or how long you've been in charge. For Simon Cowell, that something didn't arrive as a single moment. It didn't come with a headline or a press conference or a prepared statement. It arrived in layers, quietly at first, then undeniably. A health scare that moved people who never thought they'd feel anything close to sympathy for him. A relationship that gradually, genuinely, changed the way the world saw him. A body that began telling a different story than the one he had spent decades carefully projecting. And a chapter of life, this one at 66, that feels, to those paying close attention, like nothing that came before it. Fans who have followed him for years have noticed it. People within the industry have spoken about it carefully, in the measured way people speak when they aren't quite sure what they're seeing. Questions have been raised about what is really happening behind the image that still shows up on television. Still composed, still controlled, still unmistakably him. This is not a story about scandal. It is not a story about failure. It is something quieter than that, and because of that, something far more affecting. This is the story of a man, a real one, facing something deeply, unavoidably human. Simon Cowell didn't grow up with the kind of life that produces gentle people. He was born in Brighton in 1959, the son of a property developer and a ballet dancer. The family moved to Hertfordshire when he was young, and by most accounts, his childhood was comfortable but not particularly warm in the emotional sense, not the kind of warmth that softens a person at the edges. He wasn't a natural student, he wasn't drawn to the paths that were laid out for him. What he was drawn to deeply and almost obsessively was music, not performing it, not writing it, shaping it. Deciding what the world would hear. He started at the bottom in the mailroom at EMI Music Publishing as a teenager, doing the work that nobody else wanted. He didn't stay there long, not because the industry welcomed him or opened its doors out of recognition, but because he pushed his way through by force of will and instinct alone. He started his own record label. It failed. He fell into serious debt. He had to dismantle what he'd built and begin again, carrying the weight of that collapse with him. It's something he has spoken about in rare, honest moments, the experience of genuine professional failure, of losing everything he had worked toward and having no choice but to start over. That experience marked him, it sharpened him, and it explained a great deal about the man he would become. What emerged from those early years was someone who had learned, through real hardship rather than theory, to trust his instincts above everything else. Not relationships, not charm. Not the opinion of the room, his own judgment. And when he was wrong, he cut his losses and moved forward without looking back. It was a particular kind of discipline, and it shaped every decision that followed. By the time Pop Idol launched in Britain in 2001, and then American Idol made its way into American homes shortly after, Simon Cowell was already a known figure in the industry. But the wider world was meeting him for the first time, and the reaction was complicated. He said things on television that simply didn't get said on television. He looked at someone who had just laid their heart open on a stage and told them without cruelty but without softening that it wasn't good enough. People were outraged, and then they kept watching. They came back the following week. Because something about the honesty, even the uncomfortable kind, felt more respectful than the polite, managed fictions that television had trained everyone to expect. The X Factor followed. Then Britain's Got Talent, then America's Got Talent. His production company Sicko Entertainment became a machine that moved at the speed of his instincts. Susan Boyle, One Direction, Little Mix. These weren't just television moments, they were cultural events, and his fingerprints were on every one of them. For a long time, it genuinely seemed like Simon Cowell existed outside the normal conditions of life. Consequences that caught up with other people in his world seemed to move around him. He aged in slow motion while everything around him accelerated. He absorbed decades of intense public scrutiny without ever appearing visibly damaged by it. The armor held. And then quietly something underneath it began to shift. By his late 50s, Simon Cowell had built something that most people in his position never quite manage. It wasn't just the career. It wasn't just the empire, or the kind of money that arrives when talent and timing and relentless effort collide across multiple decades. It was something more personal than all of that, and something that the public and perhaps even those close to him hadn't entirely expected to see. Lauren Silverman had come into his life under circumstances the public found complicated. She was married to someone else when the relationship became serious, and it was reported on extensively and not always generously. But what followed from that beginning was something that gradually, genuinely shifted the story. A son, Eric, born in 2014, changed the way Simon Cowell was perceived in a way that nothing in his professional life had ever managed to. He spoke about Eric differently than he spoke about anything else. In interviews carefully managed, strategically controlled, revealing only what he chose to reveal, there was suddenly something unguarded, a quality that hadn't been there before. He described becoming a father at 54 as something that rearranged his interior world in ways he hadn't seen coming. He was, by every account from people around him at that time, genuinely and completely devoted to that boy, not performatively. Actually, Lauren stayed. The relationship survived the scrutiny, survived the complicated origin, survived the years of public examination, and deepened into something that had the quiet look of a real partnership. He proposed in 2022 on a beach in Barbados, with Eric standing right there beside them. That image traveled widely not because it was glamorous or staged, but because it looked unmistakably, almost startlingly real. The Simon Cowell who had spent 30 years being deliberately unreachable, controlled, armored, almost professionally unknowable, had found something that softened him, not weakened him. Softened him in a way that left the core of who he was entirely intact but changed the light around it. Professionally, the power held. The formats he had built continued drawing enormous audiences across multiple countries. His instincts for talent remained sharp. His ambition showed no sign of quieting down. From the outside, it looked like a man who had somehow managed to have everything and had held on to it. But something beneath the surface of that picture was already being tested. The kind of test that doesn't show up in quarterly results or Nielsen ratings. The kind that shows up in the body. In August of 2020, Simon Cowell was at his home in Malibu when he fell from an electric bicycle he had been testing on his property. What followed was not a minor incident. Not something to be managed with a brief statement and a few weeks off camera. He broke his back in multiple places. The injuries required surgery, a 6-hour operation, a metal rod inserted into his spine. For a man who had spent decades projecting an almost unnatural degree of control over his environment and his image, the reality of that, lying in a hospital. Surgeons reconstructing his spine was something that landed differently on the people around him than any story about him had in years. Not with fascination, with something closer to fear. He spoke about the accident afterward with the kind of directness that had always defined him. He said he hadn't been wearing a helmet. He said it was one of the most painful experiences of his life. And he said, in the careful, measured way that people speak when something has genuinely shaken their sense of invulnerability, that it made him think about things differently. That phrase, think differently, carried more weight than it might have if anyone else had said it. Because for Simon Cowell, thinking differently about anything was not a small admission. The recovery was long. He lost a significant amount of weight during and after it. At first, the people around him were concerned. But he was open about the fact that the accident had prompted a wider reckoning with how he was living, his diet, his routine. The daily choices he had perhaps never examined as carefully as he was examining them now. He emerged from that period looking visibly different. The public reaction was divided, admiration from some, genuine worry from others. Because when someone transforms that dramatically in a compressed period of time, Questions arrive whether or not they're welcomed. Reports began circulating about the extent of the changes, not just the physical ones, but the way he was approaching his days, his schedule, his body. Questions were raised about the procedures he may or may not have undergone, about what was truly driving the transformation, about whether the man who had built an identity around needing nothing from no one was quietly navigating something more significant than a cycling accident had led on. He didn't answer most of those questions directly. He never does. Television is an unforgiving medium. He knew that better than anyone. He had built his career on understanding exactly what a camera reveals and what it doesn't, what an audience notices and what they overlook. And so when he returned to screens, to Britain's Got Talent, to America's Got Talent, and audiences began watching him with a different kind of attention, he would have understood what that meant. The photographs that began circulating online, taken on set and at public appearances, prompted questions that his publicist neither confirmed nor adequately dismissed. He looked different. Not simply thinner, different in the face, different in how he carried himself. There were moments caught on camera, a brief hesitation, a subtle shift in posture. Something behind the eyes that fans who had been watching him for 20 years found genuinely difficult to account for. Reports emerged from sources described as close to the production, suggesting he had been dealing with ongoing health management. According to some accounts, the changes to his daily life and physical appearance were connected to medical guidance received in the aftermath of the accident, a restructuring of how he was living, made necessary by what the fall had revealed. But the speculation reached beyond that, into territory he has never fully addressed. And the silence around certain questions, from a man historically comfortable with the spotlight, was itself a kind of answer. What was harder to categorize was the reaction from the audience. The comment sections on clips from recent seasons weren't filled with the usual mixture of opinion and nostalgia. They were filled with concern. Quiet, unperformed. Genuine concern from people who had grown up watching him, who had absorbed him as a permanent fixture of their cultural landscape, and who now found themselves watching the screen with a feeling they couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. He was still sharp, still capable of that particular dry precision that had defined him for decades, still able to cut through a performance to its honest center in a single sentence. But something around the edges had changed, something the audience could sense without being able to articulate. And that gap between what could be seen and what could be understood is where most of the concern has continued to live. What rarely gets examined carefully, in all the years of coverage and commentary and controversy surrounding Simon Cowell, is the accumulated emotional weight of the life he has actually lived. Behind the television persona, behind the controlled image, there is a private history of loss that he has carried largely out of public view. He lost his father, Eric Cowell Sr., in 1999. Several people close to him have noted carefully that the loss affected him more deeply than he allowed to show. His father had been a significant presence, someone whose opinion mattered, whose approval was sought. Even as Simon built an entire empire on the premise that his own judgment was all that could be trusted. The timing of that grief, arriving just before his global rise to prominence, meant he carried it largely alone, absorbed it quietly into the controlled image he had already spent years constructing. His mother, Julie, was a different kind of anchor. He spoke about her with a warmth and tenderness that he reserved for almost no one else, a softness that surfaced in interviews whenever she came up. That felt unguarded in a way almost nothing else about him did. When she passed away in 2015, it was reported on respectfully, but the depth of what it meant to him, what it cost him privately, remained something he never brought fully into public view. The grief stayed inside the image stayed intact, but grief doesn't disappear simply because it isn't displayed. Now at 66, carrying all of that, the losses, the physical reckoning, the body that has made its limitations undeniable, while also holding a young son who needs a present father. A fiancé who deserves the partnership he's committed to, and a professional identity that has never asked him to slow down, the emotional weight of all of it has to land somewhere. According to people who have worked alongside him in recent years, he has become more reflective, more present in conversations that aren't about business, more willing to sit inside a moment rather than immediately move past it toward the next thing. Whether that is growth or the natural accumulation of experience or something he is navigating privately that hasn't fully surfaced yet, that question remains genuinely, honestly open. Simon Cowell has spent his entire professional life controlling narratives. He understood, earlier and more intuitively than most people in his industry, that television was never just entertainment. It was storytelling, and the person who controls the shape of the story controls everything that follows from it. He shaped careers, public images, trajectories for decades, for hundreds of people, with that understanding guiding every decision. He built formats specifically engineered to generate emotional investment, to construct tension, to deliver catharsis at precisely the right moment. He understood what an audience needed to feel before they knew it themselves, and he delivered it with the precision of someone who had been doing it for so long it had become instinct. But the chapter he is living now doesn't follow a format he designed. It doesn't have a structure he approved. At 66, the questions surrounding his health, his plans, the future of the enterprise he built. The way his private life and his public one are intersecting in new and complicated ways. None of these follow clean narrative arcs. None of them resolve in a finale. They exist the way real life exists. Ongoing, unresolved, refusing to be edited into something tidier than it actually is, regardless of how much control a person has managed to accumulate. The engagement to Lauren, still ongoing, still unresolved in terms of when or how it will take the next step, carries a particular kind of quiet weight. The decision to formalize that relationship, to reach toward something permanent, at this stage, after years of famously resisting exactly that kind of commitment, says something about where he is. Whether it reflects love or the clarity that a serious health scare can create, or the particular mindset of a man who is beginning to think more carefully about what he leaves behind, that interpretation belongs to whoever is watching. Eric is growing up, and by Simon's own account, that boy has done something to him that 3 decades of professional triumph never managed. He has made him think beyond himself. Beyond the next format, the next season, the next act he discovers, into something longer and slower and far more significant than any of it. The fans who have expressed concern about him are not misreading the situation. Something has genuinely shifted. Something in the man behind the table has changed. And whether that change represents decline or evolution or simply the honest, unavoidable weight of being human at 66 after a life lived at full velocity, perhaps no single answer is large enough to cover it. There is a particular kind of reckoning that arrives in the later chapters of a life fully lived. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. It doesn't come as a single turning point, a climactic moment that explains everything that followed. It settles in slowly, in the way a person begins to hold themselves a little differently, in the pauses that appear where certainty used to live. In the small moments of softness that surface in someone who built their entire public identity around the opposite. It arrives the way weather arrives. You don't see it coming, and then suddenly you're already inside it. Simon Cowell is not a figure who has ever invited easy sympathy. That was never the arrangement he made with the public. He offered honesty, sometimes brutal, always deliberate, and in return he received attention. Enormous, sustained, complicated attention that followed him across more than 2 decades. The sympathy that comes now from fans and from people watching carefully from outside is something he probably never accounted for. Something he may not entirely know what to do with, having spent so long on the other side of the emotional equation. But it comes. Because the story of a person at 66, still reaching, still present, still trying to hold together the things that matter most while navigating a body that has changed. A world that has moved on from the version of it he mastered, and a legacy that has already taken on a shape he can no longer fully direct. That story is not a celebrity story. It is a human one that resonates because it is, at its core, about something everyone who lives long enough will eventually face. The people who grew up watching him judge others are now watching him, quietly, be judged by something larger and more patient than any audience. By time, by the body. By the particular, unrelenting demands that this chapter of life places on everyone who reaches it. Regardless of what they've built or what they've earned or how carefully they've managed their image along the way. What he carries right now, the health that continues to draw questions, the family he has chosen and is choosing still. The professional identity that has always been inseparable from his sense of self, the losses that don't really leave no matter how much time passes, none of it resolves on camera. It resolves, if it resolves at all, in private, in the quiet spaces between appearances, in the life that exists in the room when the cameras are not there. And that perhaps is the thing that stays with you longest. The man who built his entire career on knowing precisely what to say and exactly when to say it is now living inside a chapter where the most important things haven't found their words yet. Where the story is still happening, still unfolding, still refusing to be shaped into something clean. That is what the people watching him seem to be sensing, not scandal, not collapse. Just the profound, ordinary, deeply human experience of someone confronting the edges of what control can do, and learning, perhaps for the first time in his life, to sit with not knowing what comes next. If this story stayed with you after the screen goes quiet, it's worth sitting with that feeling for a moment. Because sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones carrying the most that we never see. Simon Cowell's story is still unfolding. The chapters that matter most are probably still being written. If you want more stories told this way, honest, unhurried, and genuinely human, consider subscribing. And if something here moved you or changed how you see him even slightly, leave it in the comments. Those conversations are worth more than most people realize.